Can we just start out by defining plunder or plundering? You kind of give various forms of it early in the book, and I think it's a good definition for thinking about why this is going on, not that it's going on.
Yeah, and I think that's a great place to start because legal classifications and also kind of cultural ideas are so associated with all of these different words. It's probably why there's all these associations around the word pirate, and I think we have to disentangle those to some extent. Mm-hmm. So I try to use plundering as a more general term. Plundering is seizing stuff violently at sea. I suppose you can also do plundering on land. Armies plundered for most of this period as well, but I focus on plunder taking place at sea. And I think the key issue to raise is that plunder as an activity is not automatically piracy. It's not automatically illegal. There are many totally legal ways to plunder, to seize other people's goods at sea. You can do that as part of warfare. So if you're the subject of a sovereign who's at war with another sovereign, then as part of that legally declared war, you are entitled to plunder your sovereign's enemies. There are also legal systems whereby merchants who have suffered losses can try to recoup those losses by plundering usually ships of the same nationality on the basis that they'll then go and sort it out for themselves. So if you've been attacked by French ships, you get permission to go and attack French ships, and then they have to sort of resolve it. So there are these mechanisms for legal plundering. And I think the key point to raise about the period that we're particularly talking about in the book in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries is there is a distinctive developments in these laws of plunder, or laws of prize, as they're often called, because legal plundering is called prize. A ship that you've seized that's legal is your prize. And so the kind of category of piracy, which is illegal plunder, remains relatively clear. If you're doing plundering without permission, that's piracy. But actually, very few people do that. Most people claim some kind of association with a sovereign or warfare or something like that. And then the debate becomes, well, is this legal? Is it piracy? Is it legal kinds of plundering? And the laws that apply to those activities are developing and changing across this period. They're changing in scope. They're changing in process, in the kinds of legal jurisdiction. And that's a really essential part in the rise of international law. In fact, kind of modern international law is coming into being very much through these process of disagreements between different monarchs. Usually you call your own plunderers privateers, or there are other terms in other languages as well. In fact, the word privateer appears for the first time in this period. And I think that's a kind of signal that something's going on. They need new words to talk about these things. And you tend to call your enemies pirates, right? That's the sort of basic distinction. So the arguments between different lawyers, different monarchs about who is a pirate, who is a privateer, are a key part of the emergence of systems of international law that's going on through these centuries. Sure.
Well, so and the other thing that comes to mind from your book is, in some respects, there were parts of this idea of privateering or piracy where I actually was thinking, well, if the monarch gives you a charter or a blessing or a letter of marque, as they might have, to go out and attack Spanish ships, and investors in London are willing to back you for a take of the profits, I thought, well, the plunder is just performance fees like a hedge fund would collect nowadays after taking capital from wealthy investors. In reality, wasn't that the upside for some parties to be involved financially in these operations?
Definitely. The incentive is there. It's a very profitable business, and it is a business, and several historians have talked about the economics of it as a business. It's not about destroying commodities, it's about rerouting commodities. And so usually one of the kind of aspects of plunder is the incentive arises where you can't access it through legitimate trade. So a good example is the Spanish Empire. The Spanish Empire tries to exclude competitors from the Americas. And so those competitors, such as Dutch merchants, English merchants, French merchants who aren't able to trade legally, will smuggle, and they will support plundering voyages. You see similar situations with the East India Company having a monopoly over trade in the Indian Ocean, and then merchants in the American colonies are happy to support plundering voyages because it means they don't have to pay the high prices that the East India Company is supporting. So there are some instances where the plundering is so profitable that it sort of exceeds crown income in England at this time. It's a big business, and it is clearly considered to be a worthwhile and legal investment by enough people. Obviously, there are variations. If you knowingly invest in something that is piracy, you could well get in trouble. And one of those changes in law actually is to make it easier to prosecute backers as well as pirates themselves.
Sure, follow the money. Yeah,
absolutely, right. Try and disencourage, because the government in London is really worried about colonial merchants in New York and Carolina and Rhode Island who are deeply involved in these voyages. So the kind of relationship does change at times, but at no point is plundering itself entirely illegal at this time. So investors can find ways.
So since we talked about some of the financial backing of this, you really early in the book, for our listeners to make a note of, you talk about labor supply, and you bring that up as an idea of piracy or these kind of open sea activities against various nations. If I had to, you're the labor economist analyzing the pirate economy of the 17th century, or even earlier than that. What would you lay out as the optimal situations to cause, privateering, piracy, plundering to pick up? Was it because, to your point, there were a lot of goods, or was it because there weren't enough jobs, or what would be those factors you'd want?
I think it's the balance between exactly those two factors that you've just highlighted. And this is a topic that several economic historians have talked about in some detail. It's not a coincidence that there are major surges of piracy after conflicts. So particularly the War of the Spanish Succession that ends in around 1713, although there's long peace negotiations.
Sure.
During warfare, you get a spike in the maritime labor market because trade becomes more profitable because of the kind of pressure through blockades and things like this. But also the Navy increases in size, and you have the employment of those privateers. So legal plundering during wartime. And in fact, most people who become involved in piracy or accused of piracy, because as we've been talking about, it's a legal term. But most people who are accused of piracy have at some point been involved in the Navy or in legal plundering, right? So the end of a war, a labor surplus, you've got all these people who have spent sometimes a decade or more fighting at sea, plundering, doing it totally legally. All of a sudden, they have no job. So that's kind of the main surge. And the peacetime labor market, the Navy gets reduced in size, privateering is not happening. So there simply isn't the kind of capacity to absorb this surplus.
Sure.
And often these spikes in piracy seem to last a similar amount of time, again, around a decade, possibly as this surplus is kind of worked out in the labor market. But then there are other factors as well. And so the presence of trade routes is really crucial. But you also need commodities and goods to plunder. If there's no trade routes, then you can't have piracy.
Yeah, so you need a good economy.
Absolutely. You have a concentration of plundering, particularly when trade increases. You sometimes see piracy increasing as well. But also, even at the end of a war, when you have that labor surplus, you also see plundering concentrated in regions like the Caribbean or the Indian Ocean between India and Mecca, where you have a major pilgrimage route, which is also very lucrative trade routes.
Sure.
These are the kind of areas that plunderers are sort of drawn to. But then there are other factors as well, besides those. You have material factors. We often think of pirate ships, to go back to that Lego, as this sort of isolated, vessel sailing across the sea. But ships fall apart constantly. They don't last very long. So you need capital of some kind to replenish, to repair. You need support and help ashore for provisions, for fences to actually sell your plunder, or, merchants to trade with. And you often need political if not backing, then sort of permission or even just tacit kind of non-intervention, right? So
blessing, yeah,
right. So you see those combinations where you have a lack of direct kind of police control or political control, but local communities willing to trade and support and provide resources, good trade routes that give you things to steal, and then the labor surplus is also really key. And I agree with a particular historian called David J. Starkey, who argues that labor surplus is the biggest factor here, because I think it's also really important to highlight that seafaring is a very skilled occupation. You can't, not anybody can go on a ship and sail across the Atlantic Ocean, not successfully anyway, right? You can do that and get into trouble. So the surplus of skilled, experienced laborers and fighters is a really key factor here.